Sounds good.
Okay, everyone, welcome to Zoom to Gettysburg. It's a program designed as a friendly informational discussion with LBGs, historians, authors, and guests. The program leaders and moderators require polite and courteous behavior of all participants. The LBGs and invited presenters will make every effort to provide accurate historical information. However, the information provided in group discussion may be subject to different interpretations among all participants. Information shared here does not guarantee passing and/or successful completion of any test, exam, class, and/or course, including but not limited to the NPS Licensed Battlefield Guide test. The moderators reserve the right to limit discussion and comments during the program. Zoom programs are recorded, but not published at this time. By attending, you give your permission to be recorded and potentially published in the future. Folks, tonight we have a guest that has not spoken to Zoom Back to Gettysburg before. This is Alan R. Thompson, author of In the Shadow of the Round Tops, which is a book that came out last year in 2023. So Alan, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you'll share your screen and get started here. Have a great show.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me here. Let's share the screen here. And let's get our presentation underway. Maybe. All right, here. Let's get back to the beginning. And let's see. There we are. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming and for attending. This is a presentation on In the Shadow of the Round Tops. As Mike said, the book came out in June of last year, the end of June, right before the anniversary. The publisher had fortuitous timing there, so I thank them. So we're going to talk tonight about Johnston's reconnaissance, the countermarch, and sort of how that history was made in general. So what the subtitle calls the enduring battles for the memory of July 2nd on 1863. So we're going to talk about what actually happened, but we're also going to talk about how the story evolved and, you know, how the people remembered it and how we get the story that we have today. And then what I think the story actually is, which is going to be fairly different in a lot of ways and very different in some other ways. So let's jump into it. And there should be a question and answer at the end. So any questions, ask away, and we can get to those once I'm done yapping. So first off, what do we think that we know about July 2nd, about the countermarch, about Johnston's reconnaissance? So first off, for a long time, it was common knowledge that the reconnaissance on the morning of July 2nd was fatally flawed. That's a quote. And it provided poor intelligence to Robert E. Lee. That led to Lee making poor tactical decisions and provided one more scapegoat for the outcome of July 2nd. Or I should say for the battle itself, July 2nd was actually a fairly good day for the Confederates, at least if you listen to them when they wrote home after the war, or after the battle, rather. The other thing that we know is that Johnston didn't get to Little Round Top, probably, even though he said that he did. He either got mixed up, he got to the wrong hill, he lied, all sorts of different things, but he didn't get to Little Round Top. We also know, in quotes, that Johnston led Longstreet's corps down the wrong road on their way to the battle, and they walked right into the view of the signal station on Little Round Top. They were going to be seen. They had to turn around. They had to countermarch, and we all know how the story goes from there. We also know that Longstreet did not want to fight at Gettysburg at all, and that he dragged his feet on July 2nd. Locksley Sorrell has the famous quote that he didn't have the usual fire that he had. He was a little ambivalent about fighting, and he really we have the quote about Pickett not wanting to fight without, or not wanting to go into battle without a boot missing. So we know that Longstreet didn't want to fight, and so he's really taking his time. And we also know that it was a federal signal station that stopped the Confederates in their tracks as they're trying to get into position for the assault on July 2nd. There we are. And finally, we know that Longstreet's delay was increased by many hours, depending on who you talk to and when you talk to them. Figuratively, of course, we're not talking to any of these guys. And if you are, then let me know, because I have some questions for them. But we know that it caused a delay of some sort, and that delay had a drastic effect on the outcome of the fighting on July 2nd, which in turn had a drastic outcome on the effect at Gettysburg, which cost the Confederacy the war. So those are all things that we think that we know, or at least did for a very long time. There's a lot of scholarship changing a lot of things, but that's always been the standard story of the reconnaissance and the countermarch. And so then the next question is, once we think that we know the general story, we have to look at where does that information come from. So if we're going to try and piece this all together, it's a good idea to have at least a relatively good idea of where our sources are coming from, who's saying it, what are they saying, and when are they saying it, are all important. So a lot of this information normally is going to come from the official records. One of the problems that most historians are going to or could tell you that they've started to research this, and I certainly found this myself when I jumped into it, there's very little contemporary evidence. There's not a lot to throw on the table from the official records. So that's one thing. We have, I'm going off of memory here, no pun intended, since that's what we're going to be talking about in a moment. But there's Kershaw's report and one of his regiments. And that's pretty much it. So you have one brigade commander and a regimental commander. And that's essentially your contemporary record of the countermarch. You have a couple of reports that touch on very, very tangentially or briefly, if it's not tangential, the reconnaissance. We have memoirs. Memoirs are in abundance, but by definition, they're occurring much, much, much later. And as we're going to see, a lot of things are going to affect the information that's in the memoirs. One quick point, just as a general point, I guess a housekeeping thing here, is there are very few times, if ever, that I will suggest somebody here is lying. What we're talking about is memory and people stating what they believe is the truth and what they think and remember is the truth. It doesn't mean that they're right, but it also doesn't mean that they're lying. So just if I know, especially with a lot of the generals and the players in this story, things can get a little bit heated with who did what and caused things and said what. I try to be very careful not to attack the character of these people, even Pendleton. But because I think for the most part, digging into this, I think most of them think they're telling the truth. Along the same line as memoirs, that we have these post-war speeches. Those are even a little bit more, or I'm more skeptical of those, because they're still good information, but you have to look at it a little bit differently, from a different angle, because these are almost a preaching to the choir. You have veteran speeches, a general speaking to their former soldiers or to other state soldiers. You have comrades speaking to each other. You have memorial speeches. They get very nostalgic most of the time, or they get very defensive or very biting, depending on the stance. So those are good, but they're also, you have to be careful with them. Same thing with the post-war articles. Those tend, because they're published a little bit more often than the speeches, at least at the time. So you have to be a little bit careful of those, because those are, coming as a lawyer, those are opinion pieces. Those are they're trying to sway your point of view. They're argument pieces. Manuscripts and diaries are very good. They're not nearly as abundant. And then you have diaries that were published after the war, which were popular, like the memoirs. The problem for our purposes here with the post-war diaries is that often they're going to add things in. So you have a diary that you scribble down as you're marching and fighting, or after you're marching and fighting, in a couple of minutes that you might have under a tree as you're getting some water at night, and then you got to fill that in to make a book. And so you do see there are instances, I cite to some of them in the book, where you can get the actual diary from the time, and then you have the published diary, and you're going to see quite a bit more. Stephen Weld is a good example where he actually breaks it down himself, but a lot of other participants, you have to put those together yourself. A big part of this is, when are these sources being published? What I tried to do is I tried to divide everything up into pre-1873 and post-1873. We'll see in a minute why I picked 1873, but that's really when the controversy of the countermarch and the reconnaissance really starts. And so before there's a controversy, people don't have a reason to be cagey about this stuff. Nobody's accusing anybody of anything involving this. And so there's no reason to be defensive, to hide anything. Once you get to 1873, then people are, a little bit more defensive. They're a little bit more aggressive. And so that's going to skew the record. And then we have to know, even more importantly, is where does that information come from? We have diaries, we have articles, we have newspaper articles, we have journal articles, we have popular articles, scholarly articles. Even back then, we have these official records, but where is all that information coming from? And the short answer is, it's coming from the individuals, their memory. They're remembering this stuff. Even if it's an official report, from the end of July, they're still remembering what happened a month before. So memory becomes a huge factor and not popular memory. We're not talking here about the historiography, so to speak, that we normally understand. We're talking about the actual science of human memory. Where are these people getting the thoughts to write down on paper that we eventually are going to be reading to piece this together? And so it seems a bit obvious, but first you have to store the information. And there are a lot of factors about that affect, rather, how you store information. So as you can see here, everybody can read. Physical location, your stress levels, sleep deprivation, adrenaline, your pre-existing biases when you're writing these things and remembering them. All of these are going to affect how you store the information initially. So just very briefly, your physical location. If somebody's on the left of the line, if somebody's on the right of the line, you're going to see things differently. If you're in the swale and you're on top of the hill, you're going to see things differently. So Abner Small, who we have his quote up here in a second, he's great, where he says you really have to look at where that individual is, because nobody can see everything, and you're very limited in what you can see as an individual, even a commander. If you go to the Emmitsburg Road where Longstreet is, and you look out to where the fighting is going to take place, you realize that there's a lot you can't see. And if you don't already know what's going to happen and what's down there, then that's going to play a role in your decision making. Stress levels and sleep deprivation, adrenaline, that pretty much goes without saying for a battle scenario. Stress is obviously incredibly high. we like to try to think that, well, the soldiers were just different back then, that it's a different time. They're more masculine. This is life and death. It's more real than it is today, and they're used to it. And that's maybe true to some extent, but not really. When you really dig into these personal accounts, it's real stressful for him. There's one that really stuck with me. That was a Texan, and it was his first engagement. And as they're walking, they're marching through the McPherson farm to get into position. He sees all the ambulance, the wagons, and he sees the wounded, and he says how he just couldn't eat. He was just so sick to him, sick, knowing that he was about to go into battle. The next day when the sun came out, he couldn't eat. He couldn't think about anything like it. And so, it's not they're not that different from us, from a human standpoint. And then the bias. Obviously, if your biases are going to affect how you see that to begin with, and then when you're going to write that down on paper, you have all these experiences that you perceive. You're going to write that down on paper. And it's important to understand, at least in a basic sense, how that all works. So when you recall information, you have what we call availability bias. It says the best way to explain this is if you're going to go out and you're going to buy a new car, whatever kind of car you're going to buy, you tend to see that all over the place. So if you already have an idea of in your mind, you're going to see that all over the place. Another example is, remember back in the 90s, every news station on the planet wanted to cover kidnappings. So people thought, oh my God, kidnappings are on the rise. Well, statistically, they weren't. It was just that that's all you saw all the time. So that's going to affect your memory. Self-deceit comes in to play quite a bit here. You're going to see that over and over and over again. Human beings have an ability to deceive themselves. And that's an evolutionary trait that people have developed in order to bluff a little bit. We don't have plumage and feathers, and we're not gorillas beating our chests we're social creatures, and so deceiving them in a social setting is really where we've managed to thrive. And so what that does is that allows you to it's a psychological mechanism that you believe yourself, even though initially it's not true. So you look at things to benefit yourself and in a light that benefits you. And then that allows if you think of your brain as a computer for a second, that closes down the tab, lying, and it's just running you truth 2.0. And so it saves up some literally memory. And that comes into play a lot too. And that's why I don't think a lot of people are lying, but they're also not necessarily correct. We have misinformation. We like to think of our memory as stored in these little drawers, like a card catalog. And that's really not how memory works at all. It's more of like that big photo bin that you have in the basement or the closet, where stuff's just all mushed together. And then your friends come and they throw some of their stuff in, and your family throws some of theirs in, and now you don't know whose photos are whose. So the analogy is, whose memories am I really pulling out of that memory bin? Are they mine? Or are they somebody that I was just speaking to, an old war buddy? His view, we talked about physical location and the views that you get, the biases you have. Those are all going to affect your own memory, because the memories tend to stick together. False memory is along the same lines. And so we have all of these different problems with how we store memory and how we pull them out. And so since all we have to work with here are people's memories, we have to at least be aware of that as we're digging into this. And that obviously doesn't mean that we can't figure out what happened. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here talking and nobody would be having conversations about this. But it does mean that we have to pay attention to these sources, and we have to be able to sift through them. Kershaw, in a letter to John Batchelder, obviously after the war, says that we have to sift through these accounts because nobody knows everything. And they don't even know what they don't know sometimes. So some examples of these, misinformation, self-deceit, availability bias, just misremembering in general is what we can call this. Campbell Brown, Ewell's stepson, he's on his staff. He goes back to the battlefield after the war, obviously. He can't go back to it before the war. He goes back and he wrote the book. He wrote his war experiences out. And in the University of North Carolina, in their records, they actually have his notes that he wrote, the handwritten manuscript with his notes. And his notes, he writes down when he went back that as to the height of Cemetery Hill, it's much less than I thought. So in his mind, he's remembering Cemetery Hill as being huge, and it's huge in his memory. But then he goes back, oh, it's not quite as big as I remembered it. And this is way off topic, but when we're talking about memory, one of the things about the evening attack on July 2nd on Cemetery Ridge, with Wilcox is, that they describe it as a mountain. And obviously it's not a mountain, but this kind of points to maybe what he was thinking about. Benjamin Humphreys, Barksdale's brigade says, my difficulty about Gettysburg is reconciling what I saw at the time and what I heard from others after the battle. He's having a hard time figuring out what he remembered, what other people remembered, and kind of squaring that together, which is a huge problem for these guys. There's been so much written on the subject, it's getting very difficult to reconcile the versions of undoubtedly honest and well-meaning men. Again, you have this self-deceit, you have this misremembering. So people are wrong, but they're honest. And here's the quote from Abner Small, and I love this quote. I'm sure most of you or many of you are familiar with it. But any member of a regiment can have little knowledge of any movements outside of his immediate command, and he has to draw upon imagination or from others' experience. And that's sort of what we were just talking about. The imagination does fill in. That's where that bias comes in. You can't see everything all at once, so your memory fills in the gaps of what it doesn't really remember with its past experience or his imagination. The inequalities of the ground, the wooded slopes, deep ravines, fog, dense smoke, and apparent and often real confusion of troops. They're moving in different directions and under different orders. It utterly precludes, says Small, that there's any possibility of a correct and detailed observation of a battle in any sort of magnitude. So what he's basically saying is you really have to look at these accounts, understand that they are the best memories that these guys had, and they're making an honest effort. But just because one person said it and they were there doesn't mean that that's actually what happened. It's not to take anything at all away from their experience, their memory, their valor, their pick another adjective. But it does mean that if we're trying to figure out what actually happened at any given time, we have to realize that just because they wrote it down later and they were there doesn't automatically mean that that is, the quote unquote gospel. And so to wrap up this this preliminary part, which again is very important, I think anyways, is Jubal Early and the lost cause. Now, I want to make it clear that when I talk about the lost cause, that's a very politically charged term today. And this isn't about politics or anything of the sort. So I'm using it in the way that he meant it, because he is the one that coined this term. And if he didn't come up with it, he's the one that used it the most at the beginning. And so what he means is the whole idea of there was no way that the South could have won. And so in his mind, the way he uses the term is that it was a valorous cause, almost like the 300 at Thermopylae, where they did their duty, they tried their best, they knew they couldn't, but they did what they needed to anyway. And so that's how we're using the lost cause, is that there was no way the South could have won, but they gave it their best effort. William Pendleton, again, I use the word crusade not to be provocative, but because that's really what he believed he was on. He and Early, if you read what they wrote, not what people wrote about them, but what they actually wrote, they really did believe, or presented anyways. I'm not in their head. I don't know what they believed, but they presented it as a holy crusade. The religious imagery is all over the place, and they even say in their letters that this is kind of on purpose. McLaws and Longstreet, they are obviously major sources in this whole controversy, and they have their own problems. McLaws and Longstreet don't get along with each other after the war at various points. You could say that they never really get along, but sometimes they team up, the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of way. But it's always a cool relationship and very cautious. We have what I call McLaws's counterattack, which is obviously not during the battle, but his historiography counterattack against what they kind of divide themselves. You have the Lee contingency and you have the First Corps contingency, and they start blaming each other. And so McLaw's counterattack is really his foray into countering the fact that it was the First Corps that lost the war for the Confederate Army because of the countermarch. And he really takes the lead on this, and his account becomes one of the most important accounts in the story here. And then John Batchelder probably literally pulled some of his hair out. You can read his letters to the Confederates trying to figure out what happened on the southern end of the field on the Confederate side, because nobody wanted to talk about this stuff. And they keep saying, oh yeah, McLaws will give you information. Then McLaws won't answer. And then he writes somebody else and he writes back and says, oh yeah, well ask McLaws. McLaws will tell you whatever you want to know. And, so there's everybody goes back to McLaws, and McLaws won't say anything to Batchelder. So that's outlined a lot more in the book, but that's an interesting story. E.P. Alexander, he's one of the big players here. He wrote two very well-known sources or accounts. He's a very good analyst, really, really interesting guy, but he's also a person. He's subject to the same memory issues. And if we go back to a slide or two before, when we're talking about all of the problems of recalling information, the more you talk to other people about the same event, the more those memories mesh into your own. And Alexander is the one that is tapped in, I believe it's 1866. It's right after the war, by Longstreet to write the history of write the history of the First Corps. And so for the next 40 years, basically, he is getting stories from other soldiers. And so by the time he sits down, at the turn of the century to write his account, it's not really his account anymore. It's there's a lot of other people's accounts in there. And again, this is not to blame Alexander, but that's just the way our memories work. And he's a human being writing an account, and it's going to be subject to the same limitations we all are. Let's see here. Oh, there's some nice little photographs here. Okay. This is probably going to sound dumb, but you don't have July 2nd without July 1st. So you need the first day to have the second day. So we all know the story of July 1st. We're going to jump in just for a minute, just to recap and hit the highlights of what becomes important for our story on July 2nd. The battle opens, it escalates, and eventually the 1st and the 11th Corps, they fall back to Cemetery Hill. And we have the two Confederate Corps, or at least most of the two Confederate Corps that are there. They're victorious, but they are scattered, and they're on either side of the town, and they're a little bit disorganized. Not in a sense that the commanders were poor. You could make that debate, but that's not the point that we're making here. But they are disorganized. They just fought a battle all day. And not only that, but one of the important things to remember is that despite all of the controversy, and this is not a Ewell was right, Ewell was wrong, Early was right, Early was wrong. This is not where we're getting into that debate. But there is a lot of artillery on Cemetery Hill. And the accounts of the soldiers that were at the bottom of Cemetery Hill in the Army of Northern Virginia were all pretty much of the opinion that they didn't want to attack the hill. Every time they poked their head up, they got bombarded with artillery. So it wasn't like the Union Army was up there just hoping that the Confederates didn't attack. There were a lot of artillery barrels pointed down at them. And so now they have to figure out what to do. Part of figuring out what to do is reconnoitering. Even though we have our general story of the July 2nd reconnaissance, there's a lot of reconnaissance going on throughout the entire battle. The Confederates are in constant motion with staff officers and the engineers. They're all over the place. And this is kind of a common thread when you look at the accounts of other battles as well. The engineers and staff officers are just all over the place trying to gather information. So the Confederates are reconnoitering Seminary Ridge. The idea is that the ground is more gentle, easier to attack on that end of the field, which is not a bad observation. These guys are fairly good at what they do by this point. And so they're trying to find out the best artillery position to enfilade Cemetery Hill. Obviously, again, we said that there's a lot of artillery barrels. You counter that with other artillery barrels. And the Confederates have a decent amount of artillery coming up, and they're trying to place that in the most advantageous position. So Pendleton, if you read his report, and again, this is before he hates Longstreet. This is not to say that he's great at his job, but he is writing a report. He is there. The bias is much less as it's going to be after the war. He writes it in September of 1863. The other thing you have to do if you're going to read Pendleton's report is replace the word I with me or my staff. So anytime Pendleton says, I did this or I did that, it's probably him or more likely his staff or a combination of the two. But they're reconnoitering up and down Seminary Ridge. Sam Johnston is actually there as well. He remembers that much later. Again, he mixes his timeline up later, and he remembers part of July 2nd on the 1st. But they're looking for an artillery position to bombard Cemetery Hill. And while they're doing that, Lee and eventually Longstreet come up, and they're out near the McMillan place. Doesn't get a lot of attention today. It's a little bit off the beaten path, if you will. But it's a real popular place for Confederate officers on July 1st and on July 2nd. You go there today and you get rid of the development there, and you can see pretty much everything you need to see until the fighting starts on July 2nd in that swell. So they're there, they're reconnoitering, they're trying to figure out the best means of attack. So Lee's original plan is to pull Ewell back east. He doesn't want him to stay where he eventually is. He wants him to come essentially where general purposes where Anderson ends up being on July 2nd. And the general idea is the same as what happens on July 2nd, except a little bit farther north and with different troops. So Longstreet's there with him. He agrees. We won't get in this tonight, at least in the presentation. If people have questions, that's fine. But at this point, Longstreet is actually on board. That's a broad statement to say with a lot of evidence that needs to back that up. But there really isn't a lot of evidence out there that he's against the attack on July 1st, despite his own later claims. There's no contemporary evidence. There's a very little contemporary evidence that he doesn't want to attack. And so the general idea is that Longstreet is going to come out and be in essentially reserve. So Lee basically tells him, bring your troops up, be in supporting position, because we're going to do this pincer movement, or we're going to do this attack rather up the slope on July 2nd. Longstreet leaves to go back to his camp under the impression that he's just supposed to be in supporting position. So he brings his troops up to March Creek, which is 2 miles, mile and a half, depending on where the exact troops, the exact spot they are from the front line, which is a pretty good place to be if that's your orders. Now, this is all gleaned. There, nobody comes out and says this is what you're supposed to do, Longstreet, in at least the evidence we have. But when you stack everything up, that's how it plays out. Ewell, in the meantime, once Longstreet leaves, he convinces Lee to let him stay where he eventually stays. He convinces him that moving south is not the best plan, that he can get onto Culp's Hill uncontested, and then in the morning they can have a pincer movement, and now Longstreet would be in support and they can throw him wherever he needs to support. And so not a bad plan. You look at the terrain and you look at the map. If you squeeze them off of Cemetery Hill, now you control pretty much all of the roads. You can go wherever you want. You can move to the right if you want. You can go up to Harrisburg. You can, defend the town, and hold that hub. Obviously, that's not what happens. Overnight, they don't get on the hill. There's a variety of reasons for that. That's not what we're going to get into tonight, but they don't make it to Culp's Hill. So they find that out overnight, and Lee finds that out around 4 o'clock in the morning. That's important because if you're familiar with the recon account, the recon starts out about 4 o'clock in the morning, or dawn, as we call it sometimes. Now, what is the position of the Confederacy on July 2nd? Well, you have the Third Corps, you have Lane and Lawrence's brigades. They're extending the line south of the Fairfield Road. They're moving into position. They're a little bit uneasy because it's foggy, and they're the far right of the line. You can use a lot of the Gettysburg language, the movie Gettysburg about Joshua Chamberlain. Well, we're the end of the line, and we can't, but we're out here in the middle of nowhere, sort of. That applies to these guys as well on the Third Corps at dawn on July 2nd. So Pendleton is placing his guns as well, and so it's a really odd, not I guess odd is the wrong word, but it's a almost serene setting at the time. It's a little bit eerie, but it's calm, it's peaceful. You got wagons creaking, you have troops moving into position. Coupland Page, who is one of Pendleton's aides, he's got a great account. It's in one of the Gettysburg magazines. Tom Elmore transcribed and put it in there, and it's a great account. A little bit puffed up, is after the war, but it's a well written account. Very dramatic. It's worth a read. But now Lee needs to think of a new plan. He can't attack the pincer movement anymore because now there's Union troops on Culp's Hill, and he can't get his troops up there. And even worse, he can't move Ewell around because he's going to have to go so far around that it would be useless. He'd be seen. If he went too close, he'd be bombarded and an attack would start. And if the Union Army sees him moving the troops away, well, that opens them up to an attack. And Meade is contemplating an attack anyways. Obviously, it doesn't ever really go anywhere, but he's contemplating it at the time. And if the Confederates gave him the opportunity, maybe we have an entirely new battle. That's a what if. We're not doing that tonight, but Lee is kind of stuck. So now the other option is what was originally plan A, attack from the south, but you don't really have anybody in position to do that, and you haven't really scouted that area. You don't know what's down there because the last time you looked that way was almost 12 hours earlier, 5 o'clock or so. So 11 hours. Enter Samuel Johnston. This is where he comes in. And this is the only reason we really know who this guy is because of what he does on July 2nd, which is unfortunate for him because he's a pretty successful guy in general. So this isn't the place for a background, but a quick overview of who he is. He is actually fairly blue-blooded. He's not a nobody. He comes from a Northern Virginia family. He's the youngest son of a split family. His as most death was a little bit more prevalent. People getting I think his father's first wife died of disease, and so he's the last child of his father's second marriage. So he becomes an engineer. He's a civil engineer. Life's going good. He gets married. Then the war starts. He goes to war, and he volunteers as a cavalry officer. I believe it was the 6th Virginia, and same unit as Armistead's relative served in. And not at the same time. Armistead's kin comes in later, but that's just an interesting to me anyways, little tidbit. So but he quickly grabs the attention of Jeb Stuart for his scouting and reconnoitering abilities. That's always a good recommendation to have for Lee. Very quickly he becomes Lee's sole engineer on his staff, and he is basically the longest serving engineer on Lee's staff. He's from June of 1862. He's at Malvern Hill. He's in the earthworks at Malvern Hill. He's helping set up the artillery line along Murray's Heights at Fredericksburg. He's scouting roads at Chancellorsville. He's up in trees. He's getting shot at. He's riding around. He's very well known amongst the senior officers in the Army of Northern Virginia. Again, he's not just somebody where Lee looks around and says, you there, come over here and scout. He's the scouting guy, essentially, and he's praised over and over again for his reconnoitering abilities. So that's Sam Johnston. There's a reason he's chosen for the task. And so now, let's see if I can move something on my screen. We'll talk about the reconnaissance itself. There's a lot to go into, we're not going to go in depth with everything. Again, there's a question and answer at the end. Well, we can, go wherever we want to go when we start asking questions. Obviously, the book goes into a lot of detail on a lot of this stuff. Excuse me. So first off, what time did he leave? This is one of the places where, the beginning, I said that there are certain places where I drastically differ from the general interpretation, and this is one of those places. The general story says that he left around 4:30, and that's true as far as it goes. But where did we get that info from? We got that from Johnston himself, and so Johnston writes. He answers a question from Fitzhugh Lee as to what happened. So he gives an account, and then Lee follows up and says, "Yeah, well, what time did you leave?" And he says, "I don't know. I don't have a watch. Things were hectic. It's a battle." He said, "If I had to guess, I'd say dawn, maybe. Let's call it 4 o'clock." And that's the extent of what he says. But that becomes the time throughout history. So now it's a dawn reconnaissance. And so there's a couple of things to keep in mind. That's what time he left headquarters, but that's not necessarily what time he left the battle line to go on his reconnaissance. So he does leave headquarters at 4, but there are several accounts that have him with other staff officers riding down to Hill's headquarters. And then Pendleton does what I call a sunrise survey of the field over by the McMillan farm and the Point of Woods Virginia Monument, that area today. So they're looking at the line, they're seeing where they can see from safety of their own line, where the Union line is. And so they spend a good half hour to an hour, maybe even a little longer, getting to Hill's headquarters, riding up and down Seminary Ridge, and then Johnston goes on his reconnaissance. Now that has implications later as we try to time this all out and piece it together. So he leaves headquarters maybe 4:30, but he doesn't actually leave for his reconnaissance until probably, we're ballparking time here, about an hour later. And so what are his orders? Well, we don't know exactly because we weren't there and we don't have anybody that wrote down the orders, but Johnston basically says that his job is to investigate the federal left, whatever and wherever that is, and to do it quickly. Speed, when you read his letters, speed is always mentioned, and just reconnoitering the left is always mentioned. And that makes sense when you look at the purpose of the, why is Lee sending him out? What is he trying to figure out? He's trying to figure out if the Union line is where they left it the night before. They've seen troops coming up. They know that the Fifth Corps is on its way up because they have captured correspondents on the other side of the line. They know that they've seen the Third Corps coming up. Now they know that there are several more coming up, but they don't know exactly where. And so Johnston's goal is to find out whether or not attacking from the south is still an option, because they need to know where the Federals are. Johnston also mentions that he has to scout the roads. And I think we have a little bit of our own, and I certainly did myself when I for probably about half to 3/4 of this project, this availability bias that, okay, well, if he said the roads, they're obviously the roads that we're thinking of and we know are important. Black Horse Tavern is the main one, Fairfield Road, but those aren't necessarily the roads that he's scouting. He doesn't think that they're that important necessarily at the time. And so, because again, he doesn't know that he's leading anybody anywhere, and he doesn't know that he's going to, quote unquote, be in charge of Longstreet's Corps. He's just scouting out. So he scouts the roads, but not necessarily the way that we think he does. Those are scouted, but they're actually scouted by Longstreet and a cavalry contingent later on, under an officer named John Black. He's a South Carolinian. So he's scouting roads, but we'll see what roads he's scouting and why, but he's really looking at like the Tawnytown Road. And like I said, we'll see why in a second. The big question, does he get to Little Round Top? And, in a live audience, I'd get a show of hands, but here we'll have to make do. I think that he does. I don't think it's necessary to have that interpretation. You can make arguments that he got somewhere else. We weren't there. They're perfectly valid. He may have gotten somewhere else. But the few reasons that I think he got there is, besides the fact that he said he did, and he really doesn't have a reason to lie at that point. He could be wrong, but there's no real reason to lie, because his criticism from his contemporaries is about the countermarch, leading the troops into position, not his reconnaissance. Number two, he is a trained civil and, by this point, a trained military engineer. He's got just as much battle experience as anybody did prior to the war that went to West Point. That, for the most part. If I can figure out where Little Round Top is, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he could too. That was a part of his, that was a landmark, that's when you're standing on the Confederate side of the Emmitsburg Road, you can only see the Emmitsburg Road, and right behind it, you see Little Round Top. He wants to know what's in between. So that's a marking point. That's a way marker. He's not going to confuse it, at least in my mind. So, and he talks about commanding views. He says he got there later on. Again, I have a hard time seeing how he didn't get there. The reason we don't think that he got there is because there were other troops on Little Round Top. Gary's troops were up there. Buford's cavalry was out and about. And so the idea is that he couldn't have gotten there because he would have run into Gary's troops. And that's very true if he left at 4 o'clock. That's where this becomes important. But if he didn't leave until 5 or 5:30 even, well, now Gary's troops are long gone. They might not even be in sight anymore. And so Buford's cavalry is out there, but they're riding around. There's patrols that he has troops all the way down to Fairfield riding up and down. So his troops are not just sitting there in a block in the peach orchard and in front of Little Round Top. They're scattered. Again, everybody's reconnoitering and feeling out the lay of the land and the troops. So that's why I think he got to Little Round Top in a nutshell. And from Little Round Top, and really from a couple other places he could have been, even if he didn't, he can see the Third Corps, but the Third Corps is not in position. They're bivouacking. There's coffee going, troops are sleeping, they're scattered around the Trossel farm, the Sarah Patterson farm, probably up close to the Emmitsburg Road. I mean, you recall some of these guys didn't get in until midnight, 1 o'clock. They crashed. And now we're talking about 6 o'clock in the morning. So there's not a lot going on. You can see the Second Corps. The Second Corps by this point is passing Little Round Top, is probably already a little bit farther north. And they're going into position, but they're not going into position where they end up fighting. They're going into position behind Cemetery Hill to be in support of Cemetery Hill, because that's the point of battle at this point. That's where everybody, Union and Confederate Army think they're going to be fighting over Cemetery Hill. And so you have the Third Corps and the Second Corps. You have on your end, you see the 1st and the 11th, up towards Cemetery Hill. And so really the only troops you have facing west is a brigade or so of the Second Corps. Everybody else is facing to support Cemetery Hill. And that switch doesn't happen until around 10 o'clock. Give or take. Again, when we're talking times, I try to round in a half-hour area. So if I say 10 and you think it's 9:30 or 9:15, we're talking about the same rough ideas. But the Third Corps at that point is the rear of the army. It's not the left, it's the rear. And McLaws gives this away a little bit in his first letter, his infamous the humbug letter, where he complains to his wife about Longstreet being petty and overbearing and controlling and a humbug. He says that the goal was to attack the rear of the Union Army by a substantial peach orchard. And that's July 7th. So that's about as contemporary as we're going to get. And it's McLaws of all people saying that it's the rear of the Union line. So he can go back to Lee and he can report that the way is open as far as the Union troops go. But there's more to his report. What else does he do? Where does he go? Well, if he gets to Little Round Top, he says he did, he comes back along the base again. And again, that's a rough, he's not necessarily weaving between rocks, but he's essentially walking around the base. And he goes to the other side of Big Round Top. Again, he's scouting roads. He's just seen Union troops marching up the Taneytown Road. Well, you can't really see the other side of it, farther south, so you got to go check that road out. Well, there are some roads and some paths back there. You know, there are a lot of farm lanes. And there is an actual road back there, called Knight Road. It's kind of split up a little bit today, but at the time, there's a road down there, that connects to the Tawnytown Road. So if you ride out that way, you can see miles down the Tawnytown Road. Is there artillery coming up? Is there not artillery? Is there more infantry? Can you see clouds of dust? All of the things that you look for if you're looking to see if there's more troops coming. And the answer is no, he can't. And so now he rides back to the Emmitsburg Road. That's where he realizes that he's a little bit, he's in a precarious position because the cavalry is kind of sweeping the ground, so to speak, in front of the rest of the Third Corps coming up. And so again, back to the timing, this doesn't work out if he left at 4. And that's one of the big criticisms of his account, is that if he left at 4, you know, Burling's guys are nowhere near coming up. They're still a couple miles away. But if he left at 6, you know, or if he left at 5:30 and he's in this area, well, those guys end up getting to the battlefield around 9. So now they have a few miles, and now he's a mile or so south of their position. Start doing the math, and they're fairly close. They're less than a mile, probably close to a half mile away. There's cavalry leading the troops into position and showing them where to go and making sure that they're not, you know, ambushed, so to speak. Is probably too modern a scenario there, but that's a general idea. They have an escort. And he mentions almost being captured by Union cavalry and having to wait them out and kind of sneak between the cavalry and the infantry. And he says it's so close that he might have been spotted. He doesn't think that he was, but he might have been. And so, and so that's in a nutshell his reconnaissance. You know, he gets to Little Round Top, in my opinion. He sees what he sees, but what he sees is not what we've sort of assumed that he saw, because they're not in position yet. The Union Army is still figuring out where they want to form. He's not looking at one of the maps that we have of 10 o'clock. He's looking at the position at, you know, roughly 6:30, 7 o'clock. And by that point, nobody's really moving into the positions they occupy later. So what effect did that report have on these plans? Well, obviously it has a great one, because they eventually attack from that direction. But in his accounts, he talks about one other objective, and that's the topography of what would become the southern portion of the battlefield. And he mentions it in the accounts where in any letter that Johnston writes where he talks about what he told Lee. He says that he got to or that he says where he went, and in his last letter in 1895 he says, I got to Little Round Top. But he says, I traced my route on the map and I explained the topography, and that's actually the reason why he is sent to go to Longstreet, is to give Longstreet the benefit of his experience down in that area, you know. And so immediately after Johnston reports, Lee heads over to Cemetery Hill. Now, what to make of that? What I make of that is that Lee is not particularly happy with the report. Not that it's done incorrectly, but we've all been down there. You can see the picture on the screen now. It's not a very easy place to attack through. And so you can see that reflected in Lee's plans. Because if you read Kershaw, you read McLaws, they all mention that the idea is to get up to the Wheatfield Road and then swing around. That avoids that swamp, the rocks. That avoids all of that Johnston has just put on the map. And so obviously that does not pan out the way they intended, but at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, when Lee is really formulating this plan, that's what happens. And so we'll get to Alexander if we have some time at the end. But this is the best view of what Johnston would have seen. So just to the right of kind of the pointing rock is where you would have seen Sickles, and then you would have seen everybody filing in up to the right. And then here is just a quick, you can go on my website, or obviously in the book, we have copies of this. This is the general route. He could have gone a few ways at the beginning. He talks about following Longstreet's general route. And we all know that Longstreet eventually came down along Willoughby Run, but basically south along the Confederate line is essentially the general route that Longstreet took. This is the Pendleton's reconnaissance. He does his own reconnaissance at the same time, but that's a limited one down at Willoughby Run. And so now we're kind of going to wrap this up with the march and the countermarch. So we have a lot of things going on here. Anderson is moving into position down what I call the Ravine Road. That's basically Willoughby Run Road today. We have McLaws, who is positioned along the Harris Ridge Road. He's going to move along that road to the Black Horse Tavern Road. That's the idea. If you look at the map, the Black Horse Tavern Road puts you right where you need to be. And then Hood, this is another place where I differ from the standard interpretation. Hood is to follow Anderson initially. That obviously does not happen, but if Hood follows Anderson, when Anderson finishes getting into position, McLaws should be reaching the crossing at Willoughby Run, and which means that when McLaws is in position, Hood will then be able to file behind McLaws. I don't know how to do animated maps. I should figure that out, but it would be easier to show there. But Anderson followed by Hood, and then you have McLaws swinging around since he's already back very close to the Black Horse Tavern Road. He's already there. Berdan's skirmish with the Alabamians doesn't get a lot of attention in the main story. Obviously, everybody here probably knows a decent amount about it, but in my opinion, it plays a much bigger role than just an interesting skirmish, or on the Union side with Sickles and his move and the information he has. To me, this is what causes McLaws to stop. Now, I go into it a little bit more in the book, as I do with pretty much all of this here. But the human eye can only see so much at certain distances. And one of the interesting things that I found is that and myself included, most of the experiments we do with who could see what, where, and when on Little Round Top to the halt on what I call McLaws Hill. Fonz calls it the Troublesome Hill, basically where the column stops. That is usually done towards the evening, and it's done with flashlights because you can see all of that. We have foliage today we didn't have back then. It's all well and good. However, the eye can pick up light sources. It cannot pick up at that distance shapes, defined shapes that are the size of a human being anyways. And so the idea that McLaws was riding along on horseback, already a little bit, jumbled in his eyesight, because if you ever ridden a horse, it's not perfectly smooth. The idea that he was going to see signal flags just waving around and stop in his tracks, which is a general story, seemed a little bit off to me. On the other hand, if you're starting your march around 10 or 10:30 and you have to go around, or even closer to 11, you have to go around Bream's Hill. By the time you get to McLaws Hill, Troublesome Hill, that's about the time that you have Berdan skirmishing with Anderson's guys. And that is going to stop you in your tracks, especially if your job is to get to pretty much where the skirmish is going without being seen. You have cavalry running in and out. You have squads darting in and out and supporting, the infantry there. And so that's a pretty big problem. So that's going to stop you in your tracks. Now, from there, you can pull out your binoculars, your glass, or whatever it is that you have handy, and then you can see that you have a signal station, which you do. You have a signal. So I'm not saying there was no signal station there. But that's not what stops him in his tracks, in my opinion. The book goes into exactly how the story comes to be. The nutshell version is that Alexander sees flags waving from his position, and he's with Pendleton towards the Point of Woods. And he's one of the first people to put in signal flags in his story because he's assuming that McLaws is stopping because of the signal station. But McLaws doesn't say that until after Alexander does. And so you see this buildup of the story. You have no signal station in the first one, no real reference to it, just being seen. Then you start to build in, and one person says signal station, then Kershaw says signal station, then Longstreet says it, then McLaws picks up on it, and then it becomes part of the story. But McLaws's first couple accounts that aren't quite as well known and cited, the 1873 accounts that he writes are not really. He doesn't mention a signal station really at all. And so, but I think it's there. I think other people mentioning it. Oh yeah, there was a signal station, and he would have seen the signal station. We have the records of the signal station saying, "Hey, there's an attack in the woods, and our guys are retreating," and so it's there, but it's not what stops McLaws. And there are accounts from some of his members of his brigade that they stopped after they heard shooting in front of them. So then they have to find a new route. What was interesting to me is that the contemporary accounts and the diary accounts that I found, George Peterkin is on Pendleton's staff. George Peterkin, his family's fairly prominent, not really well remembered, but fairly prominent at the time. And he's a lieutenant on Pendleton's staff. And George Peterkin writes in his diary that on July 2nd, he was tasked to lead McLaws into position along that ravine road or Willoughby Run Road, which coincidentally, or not so, is exactly where McLaws and the rest of Longstreet's corps end up marching into position. Well, you can't really say that Pendleton's guys are the ones that pointed you in the right direction when it's Pendleton who is saying that you're the ones that screwed up. And so Peterkin's guiding into position is pretty much stricken from the record. And that's because McLaws is the one who is writing the record. Most of the accounts of the countermarch come from McLaws, Longstreet, a little bit of Alexander thrown in, and then Pendleton's mostly dismissed, which is not a bad view to take when you're doing this, when you're taking Pendleton's position after the war. But if you read his account and you read Peterkin's account and his diary, and it becomes pretty clear that everybody's familiar with this road. McLaws is not the one that discovers this new road and says, "Hey, boss, I reconnoitered in the morning, even though you told me not to. And the only way we're going to get there is for me to take you there." A lot of that goes into the relationship between Longstreet and McLaws. McLaws is often blamed for things that he doesn't think he should be blamed for. Longstreet throws blame on him. You have the court-martial in 1864. So a lot of this that we just can't get into tonight for time, which I know we're running out of. But eventually they retrace their steps. They go back, to Hare's Ridge. They cut across Hare's Ridge and ultimately end up coming down what we call the Ravine Road. Now, the last point on this is that the whole encounter with McLaws and being angry with Hood and with Longstreet, and Johnston riding up and looking for places to go. All of this supposedly happens at McLaws Hill, Troublesome Hill. down on the Black Horse Tavern Road. But if you really look at the accounts and you look at the ground and you look at the maps, they really can't happen there. Longstreet talks about a second halt. Well, that's not the second halt, that's the first halt. So there's one strike against McLaws Hill being the place where they have this argument. They push on ahead of the troops. Well, they don't push on ahead anywhere at McLaws Hill. They do that along the Fairfield Road where the Willoughby Run Road intersects. You have Hood backing up into McLaws. Well, that doesn't happen at McLaws Hill because Hood is not right behind him at that point. So those are three major reasons. Again, we have time constraints here, but it's explained more further or in more detail rather in the book. But that primary event, that McLaws Hill, troublesome hill event where the Johnston and Longstreet and well, that won't do quote that I always found what an understatement. I doubt that's what Longstreet said quite like that. But that doesn't happen there. That happens on what I term Pendleton's Hill, which is actually the intersection of Willoughby Run Road and the Fairfield Road along Willoughby Run. And that's where Johnston comes in. Johnston is not guiding the entire First Corps. Johnston is basically acting as a temporary guide from the position McLaws starts out in to the Willoughby Run Road. And later on, which is only maybe a quarter to half a mile. He's basically leading him across Harris Ridge to Pendleton's Hill and the Willoughby Run Road. And again, there are a lot of accounts where you can piece this together that show that, but that's why nobody is lying. Johnston's not leading anybody anywhere. McLaws does remember that he's leading them somewhere. It's just not where we've all interpreted it to be. And McLaws later remembers there is a mix-up with Hood's division and McLaws, but it's not back at the Black Horse Tavern Road or Harris Ridge. It's along the Fairfield Road and the Willoughby Run Road along Willoughby Run. And they do push ahead. They do think that they've been seen, but that's not before the countermarch. That's at the end of it. Again, along this Pendleton's Hill. And so we see how that memory really just comes in and gets mixed up. We don't have time to get to Alexander tonight, maybe in the question and answer, but I'll leave that one for kind of a suspense. Read the book, find out what happened to Alexander. Where did they not follow his tracks? Did they follow his tracks? Should they have? Did he have tracks there at the time anyways? So just to wrap it up here, the reconnaissance was accurate. I think he got a little Round Top. The countermarch was much more important retrospectively than it really was at the time. They did maybe lose a little bit of time, but the point is, everybody's reacting to each other. So the Union Army is reacting to what they think the Confederates are doing. The Confederates are reacting to the situation they find, Sickles in. If they're there earlier, well, then all that activity has happened that alerts Sickles is happening earlier. So Sickles is moving earlier, which means these things all happen together. And even if they didn't, the line is still going to be relatively the same. And so we're really pushing everything north a little bit. Instead of a way marker and a tour stop at the wheat field, the Rose wheat field, maybe we have the bloody Patterson farm, So the events still probably happen relatively close to the way they do, but that's what ifs. And, we're not really getting into that. The delay was not fatal because there really wasn't a huge delay. Again, memory. Think of Ewell's Campbell Brown, Ewell's stepson, remembering Cemetery Hill being a lot bigger than it was. I remember this being a lot longer and more important than it was later. And the last thing is, be diligent with sources. These are all people. These are we see them in monuments and photos and black and white photos and musty, crisp, aged pages, and they were human beings. that argued just like we argue today. It's having a source, is no different than taking an article or somebody writing today, an opinion piece, but 150 years from now, using that as a primary source and saying, here's what happened. We're all human beings and we're subject to our own biases. So that's the presentation. I appreciate everybody hanging out and getting my thoughts on this. If you're interested in more, the information was up there. Website is alanrthompson.com. You can order books, you can order signed copies, you can there's a virtual bibliography. So if you want to go to any of these sources, click on the link and they're there to the best of my ability to get them out publicly without infringing on copyrights and duplicating anything. There's maps, there's photos, all sorts of good stuff there. So thanks for listening.
All right, Alan, thank you. Excellent work. I'm going to stop the recording here. Fran, would